This video is sponsored by the Armchair Historian website. More on that later. If you haven't seen my videos on Lexington and Concord, as well as Bunker Hill, I highly recommend you watch those before watching this episode. On June 17, 1775, the British Army successfully captured Breed's Hill from colonial forces, thereby asserting almost complete control over the Charlestown Peninsula. But victory came at a cost. The city of Charlestown was in ruins, hundreds lay dead, and hundreds more were wounded in a battle that was supposed to be quick and decisive. Sure, His Majesty's army experienced far worse casualty rates during the battles of the 7 Years' War, but the British High Command had ample reason to be concerned. 1/3 of the 3,000 British regulars sent to fight at Bunker Hill were either killed or wounded, and they were up against only about half of the 2,400 American militiamen stationed in the region, the other half being held in reserve. General Sir Henry Clinton, one of the 4 British generals at Boston, wrote this about Bunker Hill: "Another such victory would have ruined us." Nominally, the Battle of Bunker Hill was a victory, but the follow-up attack the British had planned to launch at Dorchester Heights was completely out of the question in its aftermath. Instead, British forces had to wait once more for reinforcements. While the British forces besieged in Boston waited, veteran of the 7 Years' War General George Washington took command as Commander-in-Chief of the ill-supplied Continental Army the following month. He quickly began extensive drilling and organized the militia leaders into a discernible chain of command. Additionally, at the end of the same month, thousands of reinforcements arrived, many of whom were riflemen equipped with the Kentucky long rifle. This weapon was highly effective in long-range combat, but as W.J. Wood writes in his book Battles of the Revolutionary War 1775 to 1781, the rifle had serious tactical drawbacks. It took too long to load. A trained Continental could fire 3 rounds with his musket while a rifleman was still reloading, and it could not be fitted with a bayonet. The rifleman was found to be effective only in irregular operations, which were characterized by scouting and skirmishing. And that's exactly how Washington employed them. As defenses were hastily improved around the Boston and Charlestown necks, the American riflemen were ordered to fire on exposed British columns patrolling around Boston and Charlestown. Throughout August, several skirmishes broke out between American and British forces, although casualties were relatively minor for both sides. By September, the air of indecisiveness was wearing on Washington. Winter was just a few months away, and knowing that the army was still short on supplies, he was not confident that his men would stay loyal amid the freezing temperatures, especially since their enlistments would expire by December 31st. Thus, he began drawing up plans. Perhaps after watching Saving Private Ryan one too many times, Washington found himself attracted to the idea of a massive amphibious landing on the shores of Boston, but his war council helpfully reminded him that the boats at his disposal were dinghies, and the British Navy, the finest in the world, was still patrolling the harbor. Okay, maybe an amphibious landing would have to wait. His second plan was to send approximately 1,000 troops under his most trustworthy commander, none other than Colonel Benedict Arnold, to go cause a fuss in Quebec, and by that we mean begin the invasion of Canada. Since Washington couldn't launch his epic amphibious landing, he had no shortage of manpower, even with this detachment's absence. Well, October passed and both sides showed little sign of initiative. In the following month, more skirmishing ensued. The British stole food and livestock, and presumably in what the Patriots saw as rightful retaliation, they stole a British ship. Maybe Washington could get his naval invasion after all. Or not. As winter set in, morale was at its lowest, and so too were American supplies. There was a shortage of cannon, munitions, and even muskets. Some men were armed with only melee weapons. To make matters worse, Benedict Arnold, who had been tasked with campaigning in Canada, had been decisively defeated in the Battle of Quebec on December 31st. The British weren't much better off. There wasn't enough timber for firewood, so quite counterintuitively, buildings had to be torn down to produce heat. A smallpox outbreak also began to rack those in the city, and soon spread to Washington's troops. By February, the inaction was making Washington anxious once more, so he devised a completely new and groundbreaking, or shall I say ice-breaking plan. He would organize thousands of militia, some of which were still armed with spears, and frantically sprint across the frozen lake, launching a quasi-amphibious assault. But wait, General Henry Knox just arrived on the scene, having hauled 60 tons of cannon across a distance of 300 miles from Fort Ticonderoga all the way to Boston. Washington scrapped his amphibious assault plan and hatched a new scheme to sneak all of Knox's heavy cannon up to Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston Harbor. There, Washington could use the elevated terrain to target British supply ships without receiving counterfire. Starting on March 2nd, a multi-day cannonade began west and north of Boston as a diversion, as the tall ground on Dorchester Heights was being fortified in the south. On the night of March 4th, the heavy cannon were transported to Dorchester Heights, using bales of hay laid all along the road to conceal their movement. The next morning, British General William Howe discovered the cannon, and just as he had launched an attack on Charlestown, he planned to launch another attack to seize the now heavily fortified Dorchester Heights. But amphibious landings are really hard to plan, aren't they? After meeting with his staff, Howe decided to cut his losses by evacuating the city and regrouping in Nova Scotia. On March 17th, the British garrison at Boston, numbering some 9,500 men, along with Generals Howe, Burgoyne, Clinton, and Gage, left Boston, bringing a number of loyalists along with them. The siege of Boston was over. Suspecting that the next British incursion would take place in New York City, Washington left Boston and made for Manhattan, New York. The British had been defeated, but Howe wasn't done with Washington just yet. He wanted a decisive conventional victory. New York was where he planned to obtain it. Thanks for watching. If you want to gain full access to this series, which will cover nearly every battle of the American Revolution, you can go to thearmchairhistorian.com, go to join, and sign up for as little as $4 for your first month if you're one of the first 30 people to use my promo code REVOLUTION. Those who pay for the premium membership will also be able to request their own lecture videos every few months, which all members will be able to view. And the best part is that no videos on the website will have ads or sponsorships.